Bill, so it's the 4th of July, really, what's that mean? Now it's 2022, it's all these years after the first 4th of July. Why do we celebrate the 4th of July?
It's a birthday. It's like a birthday party. That's what I understand it to be. It's a birthday party, and it's celebratory. I like the fact that it's celebratory. And, I still believe that the overall intention of America, the United States, is good. When they started out, their intention, and they believed it, was to build a more perfect union. And despite all the evils that have been part of the culture, but I believe they were sort of cultural evils. They weren't necessarily evils sort of singularly, predicated by the United States, like racism and, hideous and slavery and in mega wars. Its intention is good, and for the first 200 years anyway, we believed in that goodness. We trusted that goodness. We honestly saw ourselves as the guys with the white hat. And there was a kind of genuine innocence, and I think all of that is sort of imbued in the birthday celebration of the Declaration. So, in the Declaration, it's just, when I think about what they did with all their flaws, and they were flawed. I don't know if you know about, 12 of the first 13 presidents of the United States were slave owners. That means something, but it was a different time. There was different mores, different values, and life was simple. And in all of Western culture, just not the United States, there was this intrinsic belief in the superiority of Caucasians, European Caucasians. And, as it has evolved, we've sort of slowly realized that this is not the case. Once at a yard sale, I picked up a book that was published in like 1912 or 1913, and it was called the Book of Knowledge. And in that book, they sort of broke down the different races. And of course, the top race, to which everything else was compared, in sort of a demeaning way, was basically, it was true. They called Negroes, black people, whatever you want to call it back there. They thought they were, what is the word, indolent, and just and the Asians were, dope addicts. They spent all their time in opium dens. And, the Caucasian were industrious, inventive, creative, out there, building a more perfect union. The Great War and the Second World War, were not American wars. Matter of fact, they were sort of reluctant to participate. The wars since, well, they almost don't call them wars. They call Korea conflict and things like that.
Yeah.
And they're minuscule. I read somewhere that the last 70 years have been the greatest period of peace in the history of the species. It's like the great peaceful time. Like, for instance, we've had all of these wars, like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Kiev, and all these other skirmishes. But the total number of people killed in those wars is a tiny fraction of the people who were just killed between, 1939 and 1945. So, it's you put it in perspective. It just seems like that, but I know that wars are good for business. That's a whole different thing. But wars have other repercussions, and it has to do with sort of the new invented way for, I guess I want to say Caucasians to sort of vent their evil. You know, when I was talking about slavery and all that stuff, I don't want to suggest that I forgive them for that because it was the cultural mores of the time. I mean, it was evil. And in the 60s, they sort of realized that it was evil. And then, you know, that's what basically was the underpinning of what I think is the beginning of the age of empathy. I mean, they just changed everything. I don't know if you know, but in the early 60s, our immigration laws were just crazy, you know. Caucasians, white Caucasians, Western white Caucasians, that's redundant. Caucasians were like the standard, and every other national orientation was compared to the standard. For instance, in the early 60s, Italians, in terms of immigration, were like 9 times less desirable than, you know, Brits, but Anglo-Saxons, I guess is what Poles were like 13 times less desirable. And of course, then it goes all the way down to revisiting that notion where the ex-president called them shithole countries. So it's sort of like underneath is sort of moving backwards, but it's only because people are afraid. I mean, they're in their psyche. They know that there's absolutely nothing that we do, nothing, that is sustainable. And in our insides, you know, we might not in our brain, but in our gut, we know that we don't have an answer to that. So we keep jumping around, you know. Oh, this didn't work. Let's try this. Didn't work. Let's try this. And so it just goes on and on. And the more fear that sort of becomes part of that. That's why it's all of Western culture is turning to autocracies, because big strong men seems like, well, maybe they can get a handle on this stuff. And that's a mistake. You know, there's always sort of underneath these nasty cultural mistakes.
I'm not going to call them Caucasians because we're not from the Caucasus. Those are like the Russians. They're more Caucasians.
Anglo-Saxons.
Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah, I should have said Anglo-Saxons.
Anglos, that's what they call them.
But they are Caucasian, so, you know, you could call them either or.
Maybe originally. And they didn't get white until they walked out of Africa, and many generations later, when they were deprived of the sunshine,
yep,
they bleached out.
I could see that, yeah.
They blanched out.
Yeah.
So they're not the original man, these white guys.
No. The original man was, I once went to the New York, the Museum of Natural History, and I saw Lucy. Lucy, she's been sort of, there's older skeletons now, but she was at the time the oldest humanoid, skeleton that they had. Why they called her Lucy, I have no idea. I sort of like it, you know. They could have called her Betsy, you know.
Somebody's girlfriend.
Yeah, I know. so anyway.
Okay, about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, well, you know, the war itself was not an earth-shaking event. I went to the Vietnam Memorial. I made these friends. I did an exhibition in Kiev in like 1991. And I made these friends, and I invited them to come to the United States. They did a show at Castleton. And then I drove them all over the place. And one of the places we went was the Vietnam Memorial, the wall, with all the names. And, you know, everybody was there, even me. I've only been there a couple of times, but every time I go there, I choke up. And everybody was there was choking up. And my friend from Ukraine says, how many people died? I said, about 55,000. What? There's nothing. What are you talking about? And I said, he's right, you know, compared to what the Ukraine and the Russians and everybody else, 60 million, I don't know how many million. But and it occurred to me, I didn't know a single name on that wall. I didn't lose a single friend or acquaintance in that war. But you know what the damage was with that war? We lost that innocence where we thought we were good. We wore the white hats. And that with that loss, it's really hard to maintain good faith, hope, and in belief in what we are. And then, of course, the Iraq War. That was the first time we just invaded a country. You know, basically all the wars we sort of just joined in. But this one, we did this. I mean, again, you know, there's another big dent in our sense of, well, we are good, you know. So those wars, although, you know, as events in the history of the world were totally minor, but the damage they've done to the American psyche and the belief that Americans have, speaking of the 4th of July, that we are the good guys. It's just hard to sustain. And without hope, you know, and without that belief, that's that naivety, everything becomes questionable. You know, we sort of lose. Actually, I believe that the culture has lost kind of, its moral compass is just sort of a little bit out of whack, you know. It doesn't point due north, it points about 10 degrees, you know, northeast. So it's just, anyway, I went back to that. Now, where were we before I did that little tangent?